Now, to understand how free trade is beneficial, we have to start with a situation where there is no free trade. And so suppose there are trade barriers. And these trade barriers can be government imposed, like tariffs, taxes on imported goods, quotas, or out and out bans. Now, the trade barriers could also be geographic. Maybe there's a mountain range that separates two regions of a nation, and there's no roads, trains, planes, or boats that connect the two areas. Or it could be an ocean, right? Now, in today's world, that's not as big of a problem, right? Because we have shipping, airplanes, roads, bridges, and ports, right? So we have these trade barriers. They exist between these two states. To make it easy, we're going to split the resources 50-50 within both nations. So half the resources will go to the production of potatoes in these nations, and half the resources will go to the production of oranges. We're also going to assume and hold the prices of potatoes and oranges constant. We're going to hold the price of potatoes constant at $17.06, and the price of oranges constant at $16. Okay. Now, under trade barriers, what's going to happen? Well, I'm going to go over to my model here. I'm going to create a point for Idaho or Florida. Sorry, I'm going to create a point for Florida. Now, the first value in a point is the value on the x-axis, in this case, the o-axis, right? And so for Florida, if it devotes all of its resource to the production of oranges, it'll produce 0 potatoes and 62.5 units of oranges. But what it's doing is it's devoting half its resources to oranges and half to potatoes. So it's going to produce half of this 62.5. So that's going to be the first part of the point. Okay. Now, the second part of the point is going to be for Florida is going to be the potato situation. Now, if all the resources in Florida are devoted towards potatoes, it'll produce 0 oranges and 25 potatoes. But again, we're devoting half our resources to potatoes, right? So we're going to do 25 divided by 2. Now, notice the point, this red point, is on Florida's PPF, right? So if Florida, because of trade barriers, if Florida dictates that half the resources in the state are used for oranges and half the resources in the state are used to produce potatoes, then what it's going to do is it's going to end up producing 12.5 units of potatoes and 31.25 units of oranges. Okay. All right. What is Idaho going to do? Okay, so I'm going to create another point for Idaho. Let me go ahead and just copy this. And I'll paste it right here. Okay, now I got to create another point, right? Now, what about Idaho? Well, if Idaho devotes half its resources to producing potatoes, it'll produce 40 divided by 2 potatoes, right? And then if it devotes half the resources to producing oranges, it'll produce 25 divided by 2. Now, this point looks like it corresponds to the intersection of the Florida line and the Idaho line. In reality, this point here, it being at the point of intersection is just pure coincidence. And we can see that if I modify Florida's PPF. So if I modify Florida's PPF, this dot is on Idaho's PPF, and it's pure coincidence that the point, this blue point, is at the point of intersection. That's pure coincidence. Okay. All right. So Idaho produces 12.5 oranges and it'll produce 20 potatoes, right? Now we got to value that output, right? So to value the output, we're going to use the prices here. Okay, so the price of potatoes is 17.6, and the price of oranges is 16. Okay, so the price of potatoes is 17.6. Idaho is producing 20 potatoes, and it's producing 12.5 oranges. So its GDP is valued at $552. Now we can't add potatoes to oranges. We can't add apples and oranges, right? But we can add the value, the dollar value of potatoes to the dollar value of oranges, right? We can add dollars to dollars, and that's what we're doing here, right? And you can think of this as the GDP of Idaho, because Idaho's a too good economy, right? All right, what about Florida's GDP? Well, I'm going to copy this. The first number are the prices. The second number are the quantities, right? So Florida produces 12.5 units of potatoes and 31.25 units of oranges. And so its GDP or its output is valued at $720. Okay, so that's our base scenario, right? Where there's no trade, these two nations don't engage in trade. And you can see in our graph here, we got the same graph as we do in Desmos, right? Okay. All right, so now what will happen if all of a sudden these two nations sign a free trade agreement? Well, if they sign a free trade agreement, then what the countries will end up doing is they'll focus on what they do best, what they do cheapest, right? And Florida, because it has a comparative advantage in oranges, what is Florida going to do? Well, Florida is going to focus its production on what it does best, oranges. So Florida will produce 62.5 oranges and 0 potatoes. And we see that point right here, right? Now, what does Idaho do? Idaho focuses on what it does best, cheapest. And what it does best is potatoes. So it's going to produce 0 oranges and 40 potatoes, right? Because comparative advantage determines what people should focus their efforts on. Again, LeBron James has a comparative advantage in basketball, right? So he plays basketball. He doesn't need to play economics, right? He has that massive comparative advantage in basketball. Okay, now we want to value Florida's GDP at this new outcome, right? So we're going to come back to here, and this is, well, this was Florida, right? Florida is producing 62.5 oranges and 0 potatoes. Idaho's producing 40 potatoes and 0 oranges in this free trade, right? So Florida's GDP is now 1,000. And that is an increase from 720. So Florida's GDP increase as a result of the production decisions that are made when trade becomes free between the two nations, when there are no restrictions between the two nations, right? Idaho's GDP is now 704, and it was 552, right? So Idaho's GDP increases. Okay. Now, the combined GDP of both economies increases. Increases to the sum of these two numbers, right? 1704. and it increases from the sum of these two numbers, right? So 72, 1272. Okay. Now, what happened to the orange industry in Idaho? Well, the orange industry disappeared. One, that's probably not a bad idea, because if you try to grow oranges in Idaho, they're probably going to be, if they look nice, it's probably going to be a really expensive process, because you're going to have to simulate the conditions in Florida. You have to import soil. You have to build a big, massive greenhouse that can match the humidity and heat of Florida. So it's going to be really costly. Or if you try to grow the oranges just in some field, they're probably going to end up looking green and not taste very good, right? So Idaho outsources its orange jobs to Florida, right? And politicians focus on this, right? We're losing jobs. We're outsourcing jobs to China. We're outsourcing jobs to India. We're outsourcing jobs to Mexico, right? What they don't talk about is the jobs that are insourced, right? So the cost of free trade agreement include Idaho outsourcing orange jobs to Florida and Florida outsourcing its potato jobs to Idaho. Now, here's the part that the politicians don't mention. Florida's orange industry and Idaho's potato industry, they double in size, right? So when those two industries double, the outsourced potato jobs, right, the people that lose their potato jobs in Florida, well, they can go and get jobs in the orange industry of Florida. In Idaho, the orange workers, they lose their jobs, but they can get jobs in the now larger potato industry, right? Politicians don't mention that last part. Okay, now suppose Florida, right now at this moment in time, if both countries focus on what they do best, Florida has a superabundance in oranges and Idaho has a superabundance in potatoes. Now, Idaho wants oranges and Florida wants potatoes. So an exchange will occur between the two states, right? Idaho will give up some of its potatoes to get some of Florida's oranges and vice versa. Florida will give up some of its superabundance in oranges to get some of Idaho's superabundance in potatoes. So to make this simple, let's just assume some numbers here. Suppose Florida needs a minimum of 17.5 units of potatoes, right? Okay, so let me create some points here. So for Idaho, in the production for free trade, for Florida, this is the free trade outcome. This is what Florida production looks like when it focuses on its comparative advantage. And this is what it looks like in Idaho, right? So Idaho produces 0 oranges and produces 40 potatoes. Florida produces 62.5 oranges and 0 potatoes, right? Okay, so now suppose Florida needs a minimum of 17.5 potatoes. I should say demands. Suppose Florida demands 17.5 potatoes. I went through and altered the language here. So suppose Floridians demand 17.5 units of potatoes and Idahoans demand 19.4 units of oranges, right? So after the free trade agreement is signed, a state can trade with the other to acquire the commodities they demand. So what is going to happen here? Well, Florida demands 17.5 units of potatoes. Florida wants 17.5 potatoes, right? It was at 0. It produced 0, but it wants 17.5 potatoes, right? So we're going to add 17.5 to 0. This is what Florida produces. This is what Floridians' demand, right? Now it's going to get that because Idaho is going to give up 17.5 potatoes, right? Idaho's going to give up the 17.5 potatoes. Now, why is Idaho going to give up 17.5 potatoes? Well, because Florida is going to give it what Idaho demands in terms of oranges, 19.4 oranges, right? And Idaho is going to get those 19.4 oranges from Florida, right? Because Florida has a superabundance in oranges. So Florida gives up 19.4 of its superabundance in oranges so it can get 17.5 potatoes. Idaho gives up 17.5 of those potatoes from its superabundance in potatoes to get the 19.4 oranges Idahoans demand, right? So there's going to be this exchange, right? So Florida gives Idaho 19.4 oranges it produces from its superabundance to get the 17.5 potatoes it needs from Idaho, right? Idaho, on the other hand, gives Florida the 17.5 potatoes its citizens demand to get the 19.4 oranges it demands, and it gets these from Florida because Florida has a superabundance in them, right? After the foreign trade is completed, Florida ends up with what? So notice that Florida is out here, right? Florida's GDP after the trades occur, Florida's GDP is beyond its production possibility frontier. Florida ends up with 43.1 oranges and it ends up with 17.5 potatoes. The same thing happens in Idaho. Idaho's now GDP is beyond its production possibility frontier. Idaho is consuming 19.4 oranges and 22.5 potatoes. So trade is the thing that lifts all boats, right? Because people are going to focus on what they do best, what it comes easiest to them, right? Comparing figures 4 and 2, removing trade barriers increases GDP of both nations.